What if I told you that in 1969, Australian soldiers faced a choice that made Russian roulette look like a safe bet? Ride inside an armored personnel carrier and wait for the mine that statistics said would eventually find you. One explosion, 10 men vaporized, aluminum melting at temperatures that turned the crew compartment into a crematorium. Or ride on top, exposed to every bullet, every rocket-propelled grenade, every tree branch at 40 miles per hour, hoping the shooter's aim was worse than the mine's mathematics. Approximately 14% became casualties. Nearly 3/4 of vehicle losses came from mines, not bullets. The solution existed, a simple armor plate. They didn't install it for 5 years. This isn't a story about a vehicle. It's about what happens when bureaucrats value mobility over the men who operate the machines. It's about aluminum marketed as armor when it was really just expensive coffin material. Before I show you why Australian crews called the M113 a rolling coffin, answer this. Which would you choose? Protected inside or exposed on top? The fuse is lit. Let's watch what happened when 12 tons of aluminum tried to do a 30-ton job. It was 1960, and the assembly line at the Food Machinery Corporation was rolling out a vehicle that its designers believed would revolutionize modern warfare. The M113 armored personnel carrier represented a gamble of staggering proportions. The first mass-produced combat vehicle with a hull constructed entirely from aluminum alloy instead of steel. This was not just an armored vehicle. It was a gamble that weight mattered more than protection, that mobility could substitute for armor thickness, and that the future of mechanized infantry belonged to machines light enough to fly and transport aircraft and swim across rivers without special preparation. The engineers had run the numbers. They had tested the metallurgy. They had calculated the trade-offs with cold precision. A steel-hulled vehicle with equivalent protection would weigh 3 times as much, too heavy for air transport, too slow for rapid deployment, too cumbersome for the fast-moving battles they envisioned on the plains of Central Europe against Soviet armor. The aluminum hull would be constructed from 5083 aircraft-quality alloy, varying in thickness from 12 millimeters to 38 millimeters, roughly 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. The designers insisted this would provide adequate protection against small arms fire up to 7.62 millimeter rifle rounds and artillery shell fragments. The vehicle would weigh just 12 tons, powered by a 215 horsepower diesel engine that could push it to 40 miles per hour on roads and 3.6 miles per hour in water. It would carry 2 crew members, a driver and a commander, plus 11 passengers in the rear compartment. The commander would operate a single 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun from an exposed cupola on top of the vehicle. The aluminum decision represented a calculated bet that the battlefield of tomorrow would reward speed over survivability. The M113 was conceived as a battlefield taxi, a vehicle that would transport infantry to the edge of combat, drop them off under the protective umbrella of friendly armor and artillery, and then withdraw to safety while the dismounted troops did the actual fighting. It was never intended to charge into direct fire. It was never designed to withstand anti-tank weapons, and it was certainly never meant to operate as a frontline combat vehicle in a guerrilla war fought in triple canopy jungle on the other side of the world. But that was exactly where it was going. In April of 1962, the first 32 M113s arrived in South Vietnam and were issued to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. These early vehicles were powered by gasoline engines and would later be replaced by the diesel-powered M M113A, one variant that became the standard model. The South Vietnamese forces quickly adapted the vehicles to their style of warfare, conducting mounted assaults without dismounting, using the M113S not as taxis, but as assault vehicles that crashed through vegetation and overran enemy positions with troops firing from inside and on top. The tactic proved surprisingly effective in the early stages, when the Viet Cong were armed primarily with rifles and light machine guns. The aluminum armor, thin as it was, could stop those rounds. The mobility was devastating. The South Vietnamese even gave the vehicle an admiring nickname, the Green Dragon, a creature of mechanical terror that could go anywhere and appeared unstoppable. The initial success stories fueled rapid adoption. The United States military, watching the performance in Vietnam, accelerated production and began issuing M113s to American units deploying to Southeast Asia. And halfway around the world in Australia, military planners took notice. The Australian Army had committed to supporting the United States in Vietnam under the ANZ-US alliance, and they recognized immediately that their wheeled Alvis Saracen armored personnel carriers would be inadequate for jungle operations. In 1962, Australia purchased 2 M113s for trials. The results were promising enough that the government authorized a major procurement program. Deliveries began in 1964, though the process proved frustratingly slow. The first vehicles to arrive included specialist variants, fitters' vehicles that carried maintenance personnel and mortar carriers equipped with heavy tubes for indirect fire support. The M113s were initially issued to the Armored Center at Pukapunyal in Victoria for crew training, which was conducted by United States Army instructors who taught the Australian soldiers how to drive, maintain, and fight from these aluminum boxes. On March 19, 1965, the type officially began to be issued to Royal Australian Armoured Corps units, with priority given to the regular army formations that would deploy to Vietnam. The Australians were rushing. There was no time for the careful, methodical preparation that military doctrine called for. A troop of 8 M113A1s was hastily assembled from a squadron of the 4th/19th Prince of Wales's Light Horse Regiment, a unit with a proud heritage dating back to colonial cavalry formations, but absolutely no experience with tracked armored vehicles in jungle combat. 2 additional M113A1s were allocated as reserves, bringing the total to 10 vehicles. The crews had only just replaced their wheeled carriers with the tracked M113s, and they had conducted minimal training with the new type before receiving deployment orders. In May of 1965, the troop shipped out to South Vietnam, attached to the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, which was itself operating under the command of the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade in Bien Hoa Province. One of those M113s carried the Army registration number 134192. Its first driver was a soldier named Keith Jones, who had personally driven the vehicle from Bandiana to Pukapunyal for training, and then oversaw its loading onto rail cars for transport to Sydney, where it was loaded aboard a ship bound for war. Keith Jones had no way of knowing that his vehicle would eventually cover nearly 10,000 miles on operations, that it would survive the entire deployment, or that decades later it would sit in a museum as a testament to what men endured inside aluminum boxes. The troop arrived in Vietnam and immediately discovered that everything they had been told about the vehicle was technically true, but operationally misleading. Yes, the M113 could go anywhere. It could crash through dense bamboo thickets that would stop infantry cold. It could ford streams and cross flooded rice paddies using its amphibious capability, the trim vane deployed at the front to keep water from washing over the hull. It could climb slopes and traverse terrain that wheeled vehicles couldn't touch. But going anywhere also meant being anywhere, and the enemy was everywhere. The missions came immediately. Reconnaissance patrols, convoy escort duties, infantry support operations. The crews learned on the job, figuring out how to navigate jungle trails barely wider than the vehicle, how to avoid getting bogged in mud during the monsoon season, how to read the terrain for signs of ambush sites. They also learned the vehicle's vulnerabilities. The first problem appeared within weeks of deployment. The commander operating the .50 caliber machine gun sat in an exposed cupola position, his upper body completely unprotected while traversing and firing the weapon. Every time the M113 came under fire, the commander was a sitting duck, unable to take cover without abandoning the vehicle's primary armament. This was not a flaw that had been hidden in the technical specifications. It was a deliberate design choice based on the battlefield taxi concept. If the vehicle was supposed to drop troops and withdraw, the commander's exposure would be brief and acceptable. But the Australians, like the Americans and South Vietnamese before them, were discovering that the M113 worked best when it stayed in the fight, providing mobile fire support and protected transport simultaneously. That meant commanders spent hours in the exposed position, and the casualties began to mount. In August of 1965, just 3 months after the first deployment, Australian Army workshops in South Vietnam began fabricating improvised armor shields. These were crude affairs, a front plate with angled wings on each side, welded together from whatever steel could be scavenged. They were similar to shields that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had already fitted to their M113s, born from the same desperate recognition that the design was inadequate for the war being fought. The shields provided some protection from frontal fire, but the gun position remained exposed from the sides and rear. It was a half measure, an acknowledgement that something was wrong without the resources or authority to fix it properly. As the Australian commitment expanded through 1966, so did the M113 force. The initial troop grew into the 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, a complete formation with multiple troops, a headquarters element, and supporting vehicles. More M113 A1S arrived, along with M577, A1 Armored Command Vehicles, M125, A1 Mortar Carriers, and M113A 1-fitters variants equipped with tools and spare parts for field maintenance. The Australians were building a mechanized capability from scratch in the middle of a shooting war, learning lessons in blood that should have been learned in peacetime training. But while the improvised shields and increasing experience helped reduce commander casualties, a far more dangerous threat was developing beneath their tracks. The Viet Cong were watching, they were learning, and they had just figured out how to turn the Green Dragon into a funeral pyre. On August 18, 1966, D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, walked into an ambush that would become the most famous Australian battle of the Vietnam War. A routine patrol through a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan turned into a desperate fight for survival when an estimated 2,000 Viet Cong troops from the 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion surrounded a force of just 108 Australian soldiers. The monsoon rain fell in sheets, turning the plantation floor into thick mud and reducing visibility to meters. The Viet Cong attacked in waves, coordinated assaults that tested every sector of the Australian defensive perimeter. D Company fought with rifles, machine guns, and sheer desperation, their ammunition running dangerously low as the afternoon wore on. The radio calls back to the Australian base at Nui Dat became increasingly urgent. They needed reinforcement. They needed it immediately, or D Company would be overrun and annihilated. 3 M113 armored personnel carriers from 3 Troop, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, were dispatched on what amounted to a death ride. They carried B Company of the 6th Battalion, fresh troops who would relieve the pressure on their surrounded comrades. But first, they had to break through enemy lines in failing light with the Viet Cong, fully aware they were coming. The sound of diesel engines roaring through the jungle announced their approach. The 3 M113s crashed through the vegetation at the perimeter of the battle, their 50 caliber machine guns spitting fire into the Viet Cong positions. The heavy rounds tore through the rubber trees and caught enemy troops in the open as they maneuvered for another assault. The arrival of the armored vehicles and fresh infantry shifted the balance of the battle in an instant. The Viet Cong, who had been on the verge of overwhelming D Company, suddenly found themselves under devastating fire from an unexpected direction. Their formations broke. Their attack faltered, and as darkness fell completely, they began to withdraw into the jungle, dragging their dead and wounded with them. When the shooting finally stopped and the Australians could count the cost, the numbers told the story of a battle that had been desperately close. D Company had suffered 18 killed and 24 wounded out of 108 men, a casualty rate that would have broken less disciplined units. The Viet Cong left behind 245 confirmed dead on the battlefield, with blood trails and drag marks indicating many more had been hit and carried away. The M113s were credited as a critical factor in the victory, their firepower and mobility arriving at exactly the moment when D Company's ammunition was nearly exhausted, and another assault would have meant annihilation. But the crew commanders who climbed back into those exposed cupola positions after the battle knew something that the victory celebrations obscured. They had been lucky. Extraordinarily, impossibly lucky. The Viet Cong at Long Tan had been armed with rifles, light machine guns, and RPG-2 rocket launchers. The aluminum armor had stopped the rifle rounds. The 50 caliber guns had outranged the enemy's weapons. The speed and surprise had prevented the Viet Cong from organizing effective anti-armor ambushes. But every crew commander operating that exposed machine gun understood that the next battle might not offer the same advantages. The shields helped, but they were not enough. The armor held, but it was thin. And the enemy was learning. Because down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, new weapons were already moving south. Weapons specifically designed to defeat armored vehicles. Weapons that would expose the fundamental flaw in building combat vehicles from aluminum. The Viet Cong had published a training document in 1965 titled Attack on M113 APC. It was a technical manual, coldly analytical, that identified the optimal methods for destroying the American armored personnel carriers that were becoming increasingly common on Vietnamese battlefields. The document detailed the best weapons to use, the ideal engagement ranges, the vulnerable points on the vehicle's hull. And the conclusion was unambiguous. The most effective weapon against the M113 was not a rocket-propelled grenade, though those could work. It was not a recoilless rifle, though those were deadly enough. The most effective weapon was a landmine, a simple explosive device buried in the trail, detonated by pressure or command wire when the vehicle passed over it. The physics were brutal and inescapable. The M113's aluminum hull, 12 to 38 millimeters thick, depending on location, was designed to stop bullets and shell fragments traveling horizontally through the air. It was not designed to deflect explosive blast energy traveling upward from directly beneath the vehicle. Steel armor of the same thickness would have been inadequate for this purpose as well, but steel has properties that aluminum lacks. Steel bends and deforms under pressure, absorbing energy. Aluminum, particularly the aircraft-quality alloy used in the M113, is lighter and more brittle. When subjected to the focused energy of a mine blast, it shatters. The explosion enters the crew compartment with devastating effect, and what happens next is the stuff of nightmares that haunted every crew member who understood the mechanics. The blast wave travels faster than sound, striking the occupants before they hear the detonation. Anyone directly above the mine is killed instantly, their bodies subjected to overpressure that liquefies internal organs and severs limbs. The aluminum hull, rather than containing the blast, fragments into shrapnel that ricochets inside the crew compartment at supersonic velocity. Fuel lines rupture. The diesel ignites. And if the vehicle is carrying ammunition, which it almost always is, secondary explosions can tear the hull apart completely. The entire sequence from detonation to complete destruction takes less than 2 seconds. Survival inside the vehicle is a matter of pure chance, dependent entirely on where you were sitting relative to the blast center. Military researchers who studied mine casualties from the M113 used phrases like essentially an aluminum box on tracks and not designed to deflect explosive blasts away from the vehicle. These were not criticisms of the designers. They were statements of fundamental physics. You cannot build a light, air-transportable, amphibious armored vehicle from aluminum and also make it resistant to mines. The requirements are mutually exclusive. Weight savings demand thin armor. Mine protection demands thick armor or specialized blast deflection designs. The M113 had been optimized for mobility, and mobility, it turned out, was not protection. The statistics that emerged from Vietnam told a story that the public relations officers back home did not want to acknowledge. Between November of 1967 and March of 1970, a period of just over 2 years, United States and Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces lost no fewer than 1,342 M113 armored personnel carriers to landmines alone, not to rocket-propelled grenades, not to recoilless rifles, not to heavy machine gun fire, to mines. This figure excluded all the vehicles lost to other causes, meaning the actual total was far higher. Nearly 3/4 of all M113 losses in Vietnam were attributed to mines. They were not the most dramatic threat. They were not the most feared by inexperienced soldiers. But they were mathematically, statistically, and lethally the most effective way to destroy an aluminum-hulled vehicle. And the enemy knew it. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army began prioritizing mine warfare, manufacturing and importing thousands of mines specifically calibrated to destroy armored vehicles. They studied the M113's track patterns, learning to predict where the vehicle's weight would be concentrated. They developed trigger mechanisms that could distinguish between a soldier's footstep and a vehicle's track. On June 24, 1969, at 11:57 in the morning, an Australian M113 with the Army registration number 1-34282 rolled over an estimated 80-pound mine in Phuoc Tuy Province. The location was recorded in the after-action report as grid reference Yankee Sierra 478552. The crew commander was Lance Corporal K.I. Dewar, call sign 22 Alpha. The driver was Trooper R.G. Young, also designated call sign 22 Alpha. They died instantly. The blast removed the vehicle's rear access ramp, one complete track assembly, two road wheels, the idler wheel, and all the belly armor that had been recently installed as a protective measure. The explosion also killed one South Vietnamese Bushman scout who had been riding with the crew, 14 Australian soldiers, and one New Zealand soldier who were in the vicinity were wounded by the blast and flying debris. The wreckage of 134282 was eventually recovered and photographed. Images that showed a vehicle so thoroughly destroyed that it was difficult to believe it had once been an armored personnel carrier. The photos showed twisted metal, a hull split open like a can, components scattered across meters of ground. These images were not widely distributed to the public. They were classified as operational intelligence and filed away in archives where they would not undermine morale or raise uncomfortable questions about vehicle survivability. But every crew member who saw those photos or heard the detailed descriptions from those who had been at the scene understood the implications. The mine had not been unusually large. 80 pounds of explosive was well within the range of what the Viet Cong could manufacture or acquire. The crew had not been careless. They had been traveling on a route that had been used before, in an area that was considered relatively secure. They had simply been unlucky, and unlucky was enough. The mathematics of mine warfare were relentless and impersonal. Every time an M113 left base, it was rolling the dice. Every trail could hide a mine. Every seemingly safe route could have been seeded overnight by enemy sappers, and the crew inside had no control over the outcome. They could drive carefully. They could watch for disturbed earth or suspicious objects. They could follow in the tracks of vehicles that had already passed safely. But ultimately, survival was a probability calculation, and the more missions you ran, the worse your odds became. For the soldiers of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, the unit that provided the Australian M113 force in Vietnam, the odds were quantified with brutal precision. 20 members of the regiment were killed during the war, 17 of them in action, and 3 from non-combat causes. 110 were seriously wounded in action, a figure that excluded minor injuries that didn't require medical evacuation. The regiment rotated personnel through Vietnam on individual posting cycles rather than deploying as a complete formed unit, which meant that over the course of the war from 1966 to 1972, hundreds of officers and men served in the squadron. When military analysts later examined the casualty data, they arrived at the figure that became infamous within the Australian armor community. Walk into a room of 13 crew members, and statistically, just under 2 would not come home uninjured. In a squadron of 117 men, you could expect approximately 17 killed or wounded. This was not a worst-case projection or a theoretical maximum. This was the actual historical casualty rate. To put that in perspective, it was comparable to infantry casualty rates in major battles, the kind of grinding attritional warfare that armored units were supposed to avoid through their mobility and protection. The M113 was advertised as a vehicle that would keep soldiers safe while delivering them to combat. Instead, it had become a vehicle where simply climbing aboard meant accepting casualty odds that approached those of walking point on a jungle patrol. The difference was that infantrymen could spread out, take cover, and use terrain to their advantage. The crew inside an M113 were trapped in an aluminum box, waiting for the explosion that statistics said would eventually find them. This created a question that every crew member and every passenger had to answer before every mission. Do you ride in the protected compartment, sheltered from small arms fire, but vulnerable to the mine that could kill everyone instantly? Or do you ride exposed on top, at risk from bullets and rocket-propelled grenades, but at least having a chance to survive if the vehicle hits a mine? The veterans who served on M113s in Vietnam remember this calculation with a clarity that decades have not diminished. One veteran who served with the 1st/50th Mechanized Infantry Battalion attached to the 173rd Airborne recalled the decision in blunt terms. Outside of the driver and the track commander, we had to ride on top because RPGs and B-40 rockets could penetrate the aluminum walls. Unfortunately, you were sitting targets, constantly dodging tree limbs and trying not to be knocked off. The phrase "had to ride on top" is significant. It was not a preference or a tactical choice. It was an assessment of risk, a calculation that being exposed to small arms fire was preferable to being trapped inside when the mine went off. Another veteran described seeing piles of destroyed M113s at Long Bin, awaiting disposal, most of them with huge holes blasted into them by mines or anti-tank weapons. The nickname aluminum coffin was not invented by critics or anti-war activists. It came from the soldiers who rode in these vehicles, a sardonic acknowledgement that the protection being offered was illusory. The Army's official nomenclature called it an armored personnel carrier, a term that implied safety and survivability. The crews called it a coffin, a term that implied death. Many units adopted the practice of riding on top as standard procedure, particularly when traveling through areas where mines were common. The troops would pile sandbags on the roof of the vehicle, constructing improvised parapets that provided minimal protection from small arms fire while giving them something to duck behind. These sandbag castles became a distinctive feature of M113s in Vietnam, visible in countless photographs and film footage. Some crews went further, welding steel plates to the exterior hull in an attempt to add protection against rocket-propelled grenades. The weight of these additions degraded the vehicle's mobility and overtaxed the suspension. But the crews accepted the trade-off. Survival mattered more than speed. At stationary positions, some units surrounded their M113s with chain-link fencing mounted on posts several feet from the hull. This was a countermeasure against RPGs, which detonated on contact with the fencing instead of the vehicle itself. The explosion occurred far enough away that the shaped charge jet dissipated before reaching the aluminum, rendering the warhead ineffective. But this solution only worked when the vehicle was parked. On the move, the M113 had no defense against RPGs except speed and the hope that the enemy shooter would miss. The field expedient modifications revealed how inadequate the base vehicle was for the mission it was being asked to perform. If the armor was sufficient, crews wouldn't need to add sandbags and steel plates. If the protection was reliable, troops wouldn't choose to ride exposed on top rather than inside. Every improvised shield, every welded plate, every sandbag was an indictment of a design philosophy that had prioritized weight over survivability. The Australian Army eventually recognized that the exposed commander position was unacceptable, though it took more than a year of casualties to prompt official action. Between September and November of 1966, 19 M113 A1S in Vietnam and one in Australia were fitted with Model 74C turrets as an interim measure. These provided better protection than the improvised shields, but were still not ideal. In 1967, the solution arrived in the form of the Cadillac Gauge T-50 turret, a steel enclosure that protected the commander while allowing him to operate weapons through firing ports and vision blocks. The T-50 turret could be configured with twin .30 caliber Browning machine guns, or a combination of 150 caliber and 130 caliber gun. The Australian Army adopted the T-50 as the standard configuration for its M113 A1s, making Australia one of only 2 nations to fit turrets to the type. The modification represented a significant improvement in crew protection and became a model that other countries studied. But even with the T-50 turret, vulnerabilities remained. To engage targets effectively, the commander still needed to expose himself by manning a machine gun mounted on the turret roof, where he lacked armored protection. By early 1970, the right-hand .30 caliber machine gun was being removed from inside the T-50 turrets and mounted on pintle mounts on the roof, which allowed it to be traversed quickly onto targets but left the gunner exposed. The turret solved one problem while revealing another. Protection and effectiveness were locked in a constant trade-off, and perfect solutions did not exist. The mines kept killing. The statistics kept climbing. And in the workshops and testing facilities back in the United States and Australia, engineers had a solution. They had tested it. They knew it worked. And for 5 years, no one made it mandatory. This is where the story shifts from battlefield tragedy to bureaucratic scandal, from unlucky soldiers to culpable institutions. The solution to the M113's mine vulnerability was not complicated. It did not require revolutionary technology or exotic materials. It was a piece of aluminum armor plate, 38 millimeters thick, installed on the underside of the vehicle's hull to provide additional protection against mine blasts. The plate would not make the M113 invulnerable to mines. No armor of reasonable thickness could completely protect against large command-detonated explosives, but it would significantly improve the crew's chances of surviving smaller mines, the kind that were most commonly encountered. The blast energy would be partially deflected by the plate, reducing the overpressure inside the crew compartment and giving the occupants a fighting chance. The United States Army Materiel Command had begun investigating additional armor for the M113 as early as July of 1964, barely 2 years after the vehicle's combat debut in Vietnam. By April of 1965, the Ballistic Research Laboratory had completed exhaustive testing on various armor configurations and protection schemes. They knew that the vehicle was vulnerable to recoilless rifles firing high-explosive anti-tank rounds. They knew that mines were even more dangerous. They knew that solutions existed. The testing had been done. The results were documented. The recommendations were filed. And then nothing happened. The Australian Army began implementing partial solutions in July of 1969, more than 4 years after the mine threat had been identified. Armored plates were welded to the sponsons above the first 3 road wheels on each side of the vehicle, protecting the area where the crew's feet would be positioned. This modification was eventually fitted to all Australian M113s in Vietnam. It helped, but it was not enough. In May of 1970, a shock-absorbing footrest was installed for the driver, another incremental improvement that reduced but did not eliminate the risk of injury from mine blasts. Finally, in August of 1970, 5 years after the first Australian M113s deployed to Vietnam, the Australian Army made a 38 millimeter aluminum belly plate mandatory for all vehicles operating in South Vietnam. The plate added 680 kilograms to the vehicle's weight. This was not an insignificant penalty. The additional weight reduced acceleration, decreased top speed, increased fuel consumption, and put additional stress on the suspension and drivetrain. But the plate worked. The official assessment was clinical and understated in the way that military documents always are when describing matters of life and death. The addition of the armored plate led to a large reduction in casualties from mine explosions. Large reduction. Not elimination, but reduction. How many lives would have been saved if the belly plate had been mandatory in May of 1965 instead of August of 1970? How many of the 20 Australian soldiers killed in M113s might have survived? How many of the 110 seriously wounded might have escaped with minor injuries? The Army did not publicize these calculations because the answers would have been damning. The delay was not caused by technical challenges. The belly armor did not require extensive research and development. It was a straightforward modification that could be manufactured and installed relatively quickly. The delay was caused by bureaucratic inertia, institutional resistance to change, and a fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge that the vehicle had been deployed with inadequate protection. There was also a philosophical problem. Admitting that belly armor was necessary meant admitting that the base vehicle was dangerously vulnerable. It meant acknowledging that soldiers had been dying preventable deaths. It meant accepting responsibility for a procurement decision that prioritized cost and weight over survivability. The organizations that had approved the M113 for combat use were not eager to conduct that examination. After the war ended and Australian forces withdrew from Vietnam, the belly armor plates were removed from the M113s. The official justification was that the plates slightly hindered the vehicle's mobility, and in peacetime training without the threat of mines, the weight penalty was not justified. The plates were placed in storage, physical evidence of a modification that proved its worth, but only after years of avoidable casualties. The plates still exist in military archives, pieces of aluminum that represent the calculus of institutional failure. They weigh 680 kilograms. In bureaucratic assessments, that weight was judged too expensive for 5 years. But weight is measured in different units depending on who is doing the accounting. To the engineers, 680 kilograms meant reduced mobility. To the crew members who survived mine blasts because of that armor, 680 kilograms meant the difference between life and death. The 5-year delay was not an oversight. It was a decision, repeated daily, to prioritize vehicle performance specifications over crew survivability. Every report that documented mine casualties, every after-action analysis that identified belly armor as a necessary modification, every casualty notification sent to families in Australia was an opportunity to mandate the change. And every time, the system chose not to. The war was escalating. In May of 1968, fire support bases Coral and Balmoral emerged 40 kilometers northeast of Saigon as blocking positions against North Vietnamese army units moving south to attack targets around the capital. This was no longer a guerrilla war fought against insurgents in black pajamas. The enemy forces included the 7th Infantry Division of the North Vietnamese Army, regular troops with artillery support, coordinated command structures, and sophisticated tactics. Coral was established on May 12th. Balmoral followed 12 days later, 6 kilometers to the north. The bases were mutually supporting, positioned to provide overlapping fields of artillery fire while serving as staging points for infantry operations. C Squadron of the 1st Armored Regiment arrived to support the infantry, having conducted a 120-kilometer road march from the Australian base at Nui Dat. The squadron brought Centurion main battle tanks, 30-ton behemoths with steel armor thick enough to shrug off most of what the enemy could throw at them. The squadron lost one armored bulldozer to a mine during the march, but the Centurions themselves reached the fire support bases intact. Working alongside the tanks were M113 armored personnel carriers from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, providing infantry transport and mobile fire support. The pairing of Centurions and M113s would prove instructive, a direct comparison between proper armor and aluminum substitutes. At 3:45 in the morning on May 26th, Fire Support Base, Balmoral, came under attack. The assault began with a very accurate rocket and mortar barrage that demonstrated the enemy had conducted careful reconnaissance and had pre-registered their indirect fire weapons. The explosions walked across the base perimeter, targeting command posts, artillery positions, and defensive fighting positions. Then came the ground assault. North Vietnamese infantry advancing in coordinated waves supported by heavy machine gun fire. The Australian infantry and the armored vehicles fought back with everything they had. The Centurion tanks fired their main guns and machine guns into the attacking formations, high explosive rounds detonating among the advancing troops. The M113 ES added their 50 caliber machine guns to the defensive fires, commanders traversing their turrets to engage targets as they appeared. The combined firepower of tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry small arms, and artillery defensive fires broke the attack. The North Vietnamese withdrew after suffering heavy casualties, leaving bodies scattered across the approaches to the base. 3 days later, at 2:30 in the morning on May 28th, the enemy tried again. This time the attack was larger, regimental strength, meaning multiple battalions coordinated for a single assault. The barrage was heavier, the infantry attack was more determined, and once again, the Australian defensive fires shattered the assault. The North Vietnamese called off the attack after just 30 minutes, having lost 55 men killed and leaving 6 prisoners in Australian hands. The battles at Coral and Balmoral demonstrated the value of armored vehicles in defensive operations, but they also revealed a critical distinction that was not lost on anyone who fought there. The Centurion tanks proved nearly impervious to almost all enemy ordnance. RPG-2 rocket-propelled grenades, which were the standard anti-armor weapon available to the North Vietnamese at that time, registered hits on the Centurions throughout the battle. The shaped charge warheads detonated against the steel armor with spectacular flashes of light and sound, and the Centurions kept fighting. The armor held. The crews inside were protected. The rockets could not penetrate the armor. The M113s took fire as well, and the aluminum armor stopped rifle rounds and machine gun bullets as it was designed to do. But every crew member understood that the RPG-2 rounds hitting the Centurions would have penetrated their vehicles catastrophically. The difference between 30 tons of steel and 12 tons of aluminum was measured in survival. The infantry recognized the distinction immediately. Before the battles at Coral and Balmoral, some infantry units had doubted the usefulness or necessity of deploying Centurion tanks to Vietnam, questioning whether heavy armor could operate effectively in jungle terrain. After the battles, the infantry did not like working without them. The tanks were described as worth their weight in gold, an assessment that spoke to their protection as much as their firepower. The M113 EES were valued for their mobility and their machine guns, but no one described them as invulnerable. They were useful, they were necessary, but they were not safe. The contrast would become even more stark 1 year later, when the enemy introduced a weapon that would make the RPG-2 look like a toy. 1 year after Coral and Balmoral, a new threat arrived. On the morning of June 6, 1969, Australian forces prepared to assault the village of Bin Ba, located 5 kilometers north of the main Australian base at Nui Dat. Intelligence reports indicated that the village had been occupied by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, who had turned it into a fortified position. The assault force included D Company and B Company from the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, supported by Centurion tanks from B Squadron of the 1st Armoured Regiment, and M113 armoured personnel carriers from B Squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. The attack began at 11:20 in the morning, a combined arms assault with tanks in the lead, infantry following behind, and M113s providing mobile fire support and transportation. The fighting in Bin Ba quickly became brutal urban combat. The enemy forces were well positioned inside buildings, firing from windows and doorways before retreating through tunnels and prepared escape routes. The Australian tanks and infantry developed a tactic on the spot. The Centurions would advance to a building identified as containing enemy troops and blast a hole through the wall with their main guns. Infantry would then rush through the opening and clear the structure in close quarters fighting. The M113s covered the streets, their machine guns suppressing enemy positions and preventing reinforcements from moving between buildings. It was methodical, violent, and effective, but it was also slow and dangerous work. And then the North Vietnamese revealed their new weapon. The RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenade launcher had been introduced to Vietnamese Communist forces in the late 1960s, replacing the older RPG-2 model. The RPG-7 featured a more powerful warhead with better armor penetration, a longer effective range, and improved accuracy. It was specifically designed to defeat modern armored vehicles, and it had already proven effective against Soviet-era tanks. At Bin Ba, the RPG-7 demonstrated its capabilities against Western armor. 2 Centurion tanks from the leading squad were knocked out by RPG-7 hits. The shaped charge warheads, more powerful than anything the Viet Cong had fielded before, penetrated the Centurion steel armor and disabled the vehicles. The crews survived, but the tanks were out of action. If the RPG-7 could penetrate a Centurion, the implications for the M113 were terrifying. The aluminum armor that could barely stop an RPG-2 had absolutely no chance against an RPG-7. Any hit would be catastrophic, likely resulting in complete penetration, crew casualties, and possible loss of the vehicle. The battle for Bin Ba continued through the afternoon and into the next day, finally concluding on the morning of June 8th. Australian casualties were remarkably light given the intensity of the urban combat. 1 killed and 11 wounded, with 8 of the wounded being tank crewmen from the vehicles that had been hit by RPG-7s. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese losses were estimated at approximately 100 casualties. The village was cleared, the enemy forces eliminated or driven out, and the operation was considered a tactical success. But the success could not obscure the fact that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The RPG-7 was not a rare, experimental weapon. It was being issued throughout communist forces in Vietnam. Every M113 that left base could now encounter a weapon that would defeat its armor at ranges up to 300 meters. The crews could not see the RPG gunner until he fired. They could not take evasive action in time, and if the shot connected, everyone inside was at risk of death or serious injury. The belly armor that had finally been approved for protection against mines provided no defense against shape-charge warheads striking the side of the vehicle. The T-50 turret protected the commander from small arms, but was not designed to stop an RPG. The M113 had gone from vulnerable to functionally unarmored against the primary anti-vehicle weapon the enemy was now fielding. And yet the missions continued. The war did not pause to allow procurement officers to design a better vehicle. The infantry needed transportation and fire support. The convoys needed escort. The fire support bases needed mobile reserves. The M113s rolled out day after day because there was no alternative, and because the Australian Army had invested too much in the platform to admit it was inadequate. The crews climbed aboard, made their choice about shelter or exposure, and hoped the mathematics would favor them one more time. Hope, however, is not a strategy, and the Australian Army was about to demonstrate that institutional incompetence could match anything the enemy inflicted. In September of 1971, C Squadron of the 1st Armored Regiment withdrew from Vietnam, taking the last of the Centurion tanks back to Australia. The decision was part of the broader drawdown of Australian forces, as the government reduced its commitment to a war that had become politically toxic at home. But the withdrawal created an immediate problem for the infantry units that remained deployed. They had grown accustomed to operating with tank support, particularly after the battles at Coral and Balmoral had proven how valuable heavy armor could be. The Centurions provided direct fire support that could demolish bunkers, suppress enemy positions, and break up attacks. They were psychological weapons as much as physical ones, and the enemy respected and feared them. Someone in the logistics and procurement chain decided that the solution was to deploy a new variant of the M113 equipped with a bigger gun. The M113A, one fire support vehicle, designated FSV, was a standard M113 chassis fitted with the turret from an Alvis Saladin armored car. The Saladin turret mounted a 76mm L5A1 gun, a weapon significantly more powerful than the machine guns on a standard M113. In theory, the FSV could provide direct fire support similar to what the Centurion tanks had delivered, allowing them to engage bunkers and fortified positions with high explosive shells. The nickname given to the vehicle was the Beast, which suggested confidence in its capabilities. 6 FSVs were deployed to Vietnam in July and August of 1971, with 2 additional vehicles held in reserve. They were initially assigned to a squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, forming a dedicated fire support troop. The plan was that the FSVs would relieve the departed Centurion tanks from their role in protecting fire support bases and conducting infantry support missions, thereby freeing up resources for other tasks. The FSVs were explicitly not intended to replace Centurion tanks in offensive operations, as they were acknowledged to be too lightly armored for that role. They were supposed to handle defensive tasks, static positions, patrol support, anything that did not involve charging into direct contact with enemy forces. The problems appeared immediately. The FSVs were prone to throwing tracks, the rubber and metal links that wrapped around the road wheels and drove the vehicle. A thrown track immobilized the vehicle completely, leaving it vulnerable and requiring recovery operations to repair. The FSVs bogged down more easily than standard M113s, their extra weight from the turret and ammunition pushing them beyond the limits of their suspension in soft terrain. Most incredibly, the FSVs lacked gun sights for their main armament during the first months of their deployment. The crews were expected to engage targets with a 76mm gun using improvised aiming methods, a situation so absurd that it defied explanation. The official assessment came swiftly. The first Australian task force concluded that the FSVs were almost useless. They could not perform the missions that the Centurion tanks had conducted because their armor was too thin to survive enemy anti-tank weapons. They could not even reliably perform the limited defensive tasks they had been assigned because of mechanical problems and the lack of proper sights. In February of 1972, after less than 7 months in Vietnam, the FSVs were withdrawn. They never saw combat. Not a single engagement. They were deployed to a war zone, issued to operational units, and withdrawn without firing a shot in anger, because everyone involved recognized they were inadequate for any mission more dangerous than driving around secure areas. The FSV debacle was not just a procurement failure. It was evidence that 5 years of casualties had taught the Australian Army nothing about the fundamental requirements for armored vehicle survivability. The lesson of the Centurion was clear. 30 tons of steel armor could protect crews and enable aggressive operations. The lesson of the M113 was equally clear. 12 tons of aluminum armor left crews vulnerable and forced them into difficult choices about risk. The FSV represented an attempt to split the difference, adding firepower without adding protection, and the result was a vehicle that combined the worst aspects of both. It had the vulnerability of an M113 with the mobility limitations caused by extra weight, giving crews none of the advantages of proper armor and all the disadvantages of operating a target. The FSV program revealed something more disturbing than simple incompetence. It showed that institutional inertia could perpetuate bad decisions, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Every casualty report from M113 operations should have been screaming a single message: aluminum armor is inadequate. Heavy armor saves lives. Do not deploy lightly armored vehicles to conduct missions that require protection. And yet the response to withdrawing heavy armor was to deploy even more lightly armored vehicles with bigger guns, as if firepower could substitute for survivability. So let's return to the question from the beginning: protected inside or exposed on top? Now you understand what they knew. The mines were below, and nearly 3/4 of vehicle losses came from mines that could vaporize everyone inside in less than 2 seconds. The bullets were above, rifles and machine guns that could kill individuals but left others alive. The rocket-propelled grenades were coming from the sides, RPG-7S that could penetrate the aluminum armor and turn the crew compartment into an inferno. The belly armor that might have helped arrived 5 years late, installed only in August of 1970, when most of the casualties had already occurred. The fire support vehicles that were supposed to replace the departed Centurion tanks proved almost useless and were withdrawn after 7 months without seeing combat. And every morning, Australian crews had to climb aboard their M113s and make the choice. Ride inside, protected from small arms fire, but trapped in an aluminum box if the vehicle hit a mine. The armor would stop rifle bullets. It would not stop the blast that came from below. Anyone directly above the mine would die instantly, bodies subjected to overpressure that liquefied organs and severed limbs. The aluminum hull would fragment into shrapnel. Fuel would ignite. Ammunition would cook off. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, and survival was pure chance. Or ride on top, exposed to every bullet and every rocket-propelled grenade, hoping that the enemy's aim was worse than the mine's mathematics. Troops riding on top built sandbag castles for protection that provided almost no real defensive value, but gave them something to psychologically cling to. They welded steel plates to the hull. they draped chain-link fencing around stationary vehicles. They did everything possible to improve their odds, knowing that none of it was enough. The commanders operating the .50 caliber machine guns and the T-50 turrets still had to expose themselves to engage targets effectively. Even with the turret's protection, they were vulnerable. The field modifications, the improvised armor, the tactical adaptations, these were not innovations. They were prayers wrapped in metal. Every crew member knew it. They weren't heroes for climbing aboard. They were professionals doing an impossible job with inadequate equipment. By the time the FSVs were withdrawn in February of 1972, the war was effectively over for Australian forces. The bulk of A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, had already returned to Australia in December of 1971. No. 1 Troop remained at Vung Tau, the coastal logistics base, helping to close down facilities and load equipment for shipment home. On March 12, 1972, the last Australian M113s left Vietnam, rolling up the ramps onto ships that would carry them back across the ocean to a country that was ready to forget the war entirely. The final accounting was conducted in sterile military documents that reduced years of combat to statistics and equipment disposition reports. 200 M113 armored personnel carriers had been deployed to South Vietnam by Australian forces over the course of 7 years. Many were damaged during operations, hit by mines, struck by rocket-propelled grenades, or disabled by mechanical failures in the harsh jungle environment. 28 M113s were so severely damaged that repairs were beyond the capability of the Army workshops in South Vietnam, and they were shipped back to Australia for extensive rebuilding. Of those 28 vehicles, 15 had sustained damage so catastrophic that they required complete hull replacement using newly purchased hulls. The original hulls were scrapped, aluminum that had been torn, burned, and blast deformed beyond repair. The human cost was recorded with the same bureaucratic precision. The 3rd Cavalry Regiment, which provided the M113 crews throughout the war, suffered 20 fatalities. 17 were killed in action, their deaths directly attributed to enemy fire or mines. 3 died from non-combat causes, accidents and illnesses that were nevertheless consequences of the deployment. 110 members of the regiment were seriously wounded in action, injuries severe enough to require medical evacuation and extended treatment. Many others suffered minor injuries that were treated in the field and not recorded in the official statistics. On April 19, 1972, 1 month after the last M113S left Vietnam, the Australian Army donated a battle-damaged M113A1 to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The vehicle, Army Registration Number 134192, was the same M113 that Keith Jones had driven from Bandiana to Pukapunyal for training before the war. It had been first deployed to South Vietnam with 1 armored personnel carrier squadron in 1966 and later served with the 3rd Cavalry Regiment until 1969. The vehicle had covered close to 10,000 miles on operations, its odometer recording every kilometer of patrols, convoy escorts, and combat missions. It had carried the call signs 40 Alpha and later 21, radio designations that connected it to specific operations now recorded only in classified reports. The decision to display the vehicle at the War Memorial was intended to honor the service of the armored crews and preserve an artifact of Australia's involvement in Vietnam. But years later, the M113 was removed from public display due to health and safety concerns that were never fully explained in public documents. The vehicle was transferred to the Royal Australian Armoured Corps Memorial and Army Tank Museum, where it resides among other examples of Australian military equipment. The removal suggests that even decades after the war, the M113 carried risks that could not be fully mitigated. After the war, the belly armor plates that had finally been installed in 1970 were removed from the M113ES returning to Australia. The official justification was that the plates slightly hindered the vehicle's mobility, and without the threat of mines in peacetime training, the weight penalty was not justified. The plates were placed in storage, physical evidence of a modification that proved its worth, but only after years of avoidable casualties. The M113 did not disappear from Australian service after Vietnam. The vehicle continued in operational use, eventually undergoing a comprehensive upgrade program that produced the M113 AS4 variant. The upgraded vehicles received improved engines, new suspension systems, better armor protection including mine blast resistance, spall liners to reduce internal fragmentation, and modern electronics. Between 2007 and 2012, 431 M113s were upgraded to the AS4 standard. The upgraded vehicles remained in service through the early 21st century, deployed on peacekeeping missions in Somalia in 1993, Rwanda between 1994 and 1995, and East Timor from 1999 to 2002, and again from 2006 to 2008. But even the extensively upgraded M113 AS4 eventually proved inadequate for modern warfare. The vehicles were described as now obsolete in official assessments, and they have not been included in recent deployments due to their vulnerability to attack. The improvised explosive devices that proliferated in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated that mine threats had evolved beyond what even upgraded armor could protect against. The fundamental limitations of building fighting vehicles from aluminum, limitations that had been obvious in Vietnam, remained insurmountable. The Australian Army initiated the Land 400 program to replace the M113s with modern infantry fighting vehicles that would provide proper protection, firepower, and mobility for mechanized infantry in contemporary combat. The replacement vehicles, currently being procured, will feature mine-resistant hull designs developed from the ground up, rather than added as afterthoughts. Crew survivability is a primary design requirement, not something to be addressed through field modifications after casualties occur. The M113 will finally be retired when the replacement program is complete, ending a service life that extended beyond 50 years. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, multiple nations, including Australia, provided military assistance to Ukrainian forces. Among the equipment transferred were M113 armored personnel carriers, vehicles that had been built during the Cold War and upgraded multiple times, but still retained their fundamental design characteristics: aluminum hulls, thin armor, mine vulnerability. The M113S in Ukraine serve largely in support roles, transporting troops and supplies in rear areas where the threat of direct combat is lower. Ukrainian forces, like American and Australian forces before them, quickly learned that the sheltered compartment or the exposed position each carried distinct risks when mines were present. The lessons of Vietnam are being relearned in Eastern Europe, proving that some truths about armored warfare are universal and enduring. Light armor kills. Heavy armor saves. Mobility cannot substitute for protection. And soldiers will always make rational choices about risk, even when those choices look irrational to observers who do not face the same threats. Today, A handful of M113s sit in museums across Australia. Army registration number 134192 rests in the Royal Australian Armoured Corps Memorial. Its aluminum hull painted in the late 1990s. Auscam camouflage scheme of olive drab, tan, and black. The vehicle has been fitted with post-Vietnam upgrades, a T-50 turret that it didn't have during its first deployment, German Deal-type tracks with rubber block inserts that replaced the original American tracks. The jerry can holders that would have been mounted on the rear hull are missing. The rubber track shrouds have been removed. Children visit the museum and climb on the vehicle. Tourists photograph it. Veterans walk past and remember. The aluminum gleams under the museum lights, buffed to a shine it never had in the jungle when it was covered in mud and dust and the residue of burnt gunpowder. The belly armor is gone, removed in peacetime because it hindered mobility. The machine guns are disabled, their firing pins removed, and breech mechanisms locked. The vehicle looks almost harmless, a relic from a war that ended more than 50 years ago. But if you know where to look, you can still see the welds where armor plates were attached in Vietnamese workshops, field modifications made by crews who understood their vulnerability better than the procurement officers who bought the vehicles. You can trace the outline of where sandbag positions would have been constructed on the roof, improvised fortifications that mark the difference between soldiers who trusted their equipment and soldiers who had learned not to. You can find the spots where combat damage was repaired, aluminum welded over tears and punctures, evidence that this vehicle took fire and survived long enough to be patched and sent back out. The M113 served the Australian Army for more than 50 years. It was upgraded, modified, improved with better engines, stronger suspensions, additional armor, spall liners, modern electronics. The M113 AS4 variant that emerged from the upgrade program was significantly more capable than the M113A1 that deployed to Vietnam in 1965. Belly armor was designed in from the start. Mine blast protection was a requirement. Crew survivability was prioritized, but the fundamental design never changed. 12 tons of aluminum trying to do a 30-ton job. A vehicle conceived as a battlefield taxi being used as a frontline combat vehicle. Light armor substituting for heavy armor because light armor was cheaper, easier to transport, and fit better with doctrines that prioritized mobility over protection. Eventually, even the Australian Army admitted what every crew member had known since 1965. You cannot make a battlefield taxi into a fighting vehicle by wishing it so. You cannot add enough modifications to an aluminum hull to make it as protective as steel. You cannot train away the vulnerability or shoot your way out of poor design. The Land 400 program is finally retiring the M113. The replacement infantry fighting vehicles will have proper armor, mine-resistant hulls designed from the start rather than added as afterthoughts, protection that matches the threats that modern combat vehicles face. It only took 50 years, 20 dead Australian soldiers, 110 seriously wounded, and countless others who carried the psychological scars of making the impossible choice every single day. The lessons should have been obvious from the beginning. The designers who built the M113 were not incompetent. They made rational decisions based on the requirements they were given. Build a light, air-transportable, amphibious armored personnel carrier that can support mechanized infantry in a conventional war in Europe. The vehicle they created met those requirements admirably. But Vietnam was not the war the M113 was designed for. The mines were more prevalent than anticipated. The anti-tank weapons were more effective than predicted. The enemy adapted faster than the procurement system could respond. And when the gap between design assumptions and battlefield reality became obvious, when the casualties mounted and the vulnerabilities were documented and the solutions were tested and proven, the system still took 5 years to mandate something as simple as a belly armor plate. That delay was not inevitable. It was a choice made repeatedly by people who prioritized performance specifications over crew survivability, who valued mobility over protection, who calculated that 680 kilograms was too much weight even as the bodies piled up. The M113 in Vietnam is a story about compromises and their consequences. The compromise to build vehicles from aluminum instead of steel. The compromise to accept exposed crew positions. The compromise to deploy a battlefield taxi as a combat vehicle. The compromise to delay protective modifications because they added weight. Each compromise was rational in isolation, defensible by the standards of military procurement and engineering trade-offs. But compromises compound. Each one makes the next one necessary. And eventually, you arrive at a vehicle where the crews have to choose between riding inside and waiting for the mine, or riding on top and hoping the bullets miss. What if I told you that in 1969, soldiers had to choose between 2 ways to die? Now you know the answer. They chose both. They rode inside on some missions and on top on others. They made the calculation based on terrain, based on intelligence about enemy activity, based on whether mines or ambushes were more likely on that particular day. They did their jobs professionally, despite equipment that made every mission a gamble. They brought their friends home when the aluminum held. They collected the pieces when it didn't. And they paid the price for someone else's aluminum gamble, a procurement decision made in boardrooms and testing facilities by people who would never have to make the choice themselves. The M113 was marketed as an armored personnel carrier, a vehicle that would protect soldiers while delivering them to combat. The crews called it an aluminum coffin, a vehicle that trapped them in a metal box with mine-thin floors and paper-thin walls. Both descriptions were technically accurate. The vehicle did provide armor. The vehicle did carry personnel. But the protection was illusory, effective only against threats that were not the primary danger, and the carrying capacity became a liability when the cargo was human beings who could not escape when the vehicle hit a mine. 3 out of every 4 destroyed vehicles fell to mines, not bullets. 5 years to install belly armor. 20 killed. 110 seriously wounded. These are not abstractions or statistics. They are the measured cost of treating soldiers as variables in an engineering equation, of prioritizing mobility over survivability, of building armored vehicles from a material that burns. The aluminum gleams in the museums. The veterans walk past and remember. And the lesson is there for anyone willing to see it. You cannot armor men with wishes. You cannot protect soldiers with mathematics. And you cannot win a war by asking troops to choose between 2 different ways to die.